A very pleasant good day to all of our viewers. We want to take the opportunity to welcome you to another edition of Let's Talk. Let's Talk is a program sponsored by the South Leeward Conference of Seventh Adventists. I am your host, Dr. Carson Greene. And on this program, we discuss issues impacting the church and the wider community. We have, of course, been doing this for the past 3 years. And today we have a very important issue that we are going to be looking at. We are going to be addressing an issue that I believe is impacting all of us around. But before we do so, we would like to invite you to bow your heads for a word of prayer with us. Eternal Father and our God, we thank you for the privilege to share on another edition of Let's Talk. We ask for your wisdom, your grace, and your guidance. Be with us as we share today, and help that those who listen will find the discussion meaningful. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, friends, for the past 4-6 weeks or so, we have been looking at the subject of ministering in a changing world. We wrapped up that discussion last week, and this week we are starting something new. Today, specifically, we're going to be dealing with the sociological impact of changing gender roles from a Caribbean perspective. Next week, hopefully, if we do get through what we have for today, next week, we will be talking about the sociological impact of not just changing gender roles, but also the matter of women's liberation. And of course, from the Caribbean perspective, with us to discuss this very important, significant role. And by the way, you may notice that to some extent, this topic is connected to the discussion we had last week on family dynamics. But we are going to be talking about specifically changing gender roles today. With us to discuss this very significant subject is Dr. Ivor B. English. Dr. English is a qualified educator, a public sector and private sector management professional and maritime consultant with over 30 years of managerial experience. He is a lecturer at the University of the Southern Caribbean, a member of the University Board of Governors, a member of the Executive Committee of the Caribbean Union Conference. He is a member of the University of Guyana Council and director of Tiger Creek Incorporated. It's a private company registered in the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. He has a wealth of experience in many areas, and I am pretty sure that we're going to get him back to deal with some other areas sometime in the future. He started his work as a teacher, his life's work as a teacher, completed studies leading up to a trained teacher certificate. Then, of course, he now holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree, a Master's of Philosophy in Management, a Master of Science degree in General Maritime Administration, a postgraduate diploma in International Studies, and a bachelor's degree in Education and a diploma in Port Management. He is going to be talking with us today in one of the areas of his studies, and that has to do with sociology and history and the impact that, combined those things will have on us. We want to just, I can say so much more about Dr. English, but our time is limited. So Dr. English, we just want to say welcome to Let's Talk. This is the first time you are featuring on Let's Talk. We are delighted to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Greene. It's indeed a privilege and a pleasure for me to be part of this program. And I trust that our discussion this afternoon will be engaging, frank, educative, and help us to understand a little more of the dynamics affecting gender roles in the Caribbean region.
Yeah, certainly. We want to kind of go right into the discussion. But before we do so, for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be examining not just the issue of the sociological impact of changing gender roles and women liberation, but we're also going to consider factors influencing the growing influence of the matrilineal authority in families. That may be for weeks 3 and 4. Now, Dr. English, I want to begin with this. We are today talking about changing gender roles. Now, perhaps we can begin with a brief historical perspective. You know, Caribbean society today is what I would say in transition, with the exception of a pocket of Caribs in Dominica and the territories of Guyana and Suriname, which are both South American countries. The population is non-indigenous. I think we can say that because, you know, whether we have Afro-Caribbean, Indo-Caribbean, Chinese, we all have all been imported from Africa, India, China, etc. How has the Indian and African influence helped to shape Caribbean studies or Caribbean societies?
No, Dr. Greene might be interested for me to try to give a bit of a historical perspective. As we looked at the indigenous populations of the Caribbean, these were first and foremost affected seriously by the presence of the Europeans. After the Europeans arrived, I will say it was predictably obvious that there will be conflict. And as you rightly said, the Indian population within half of a century was totally devastated because of clashes with the Europeans and so on. The Arawak's population disappeared in the large islands of the Caribbean, and you said there are only pockets of Caribs remaining, except for Guyana and Suriname. I'd want to say that as some pundits conjectured, that the relationship between all peoples, whether indigenous peoples or the Africans and Indians that came, the Caribbean society has been significantly shaped by, I would say, African and Asian influences. And what gave occasion or rise to this was the European labor objectives. In part, the objectives of the Europeans were to be fulfilled by the introduction of African labor in the first place on the sugar plantation that was fueled by the transatlantic slave trade. And I'll say, despite the efforts by the Europeans to more or less suppress African culture, many elements have persisted, I would say, as legacies in contemporary Caribbean societies. I want to reflect for a moment on a statement in Work and Family Life, West Indian Perspective by David Lowenthal and Lombras Comtiers. And I found that statement very, very interesting. They stated that crossing the Atlantic meant for the Africans a break with their oral traditions, customs, and values, because there was no perceived mechanism in the New World by which these values could be perpetuated. Notably, I will say the planter class or the plantation owners were careful to separate the Africans. And as a student of history, I found that worrisome. They wanted to separate the Africans to ensure that they were not grouped in tribes to work on the plantation. Because if you recall, in West Africa, a man's strongest ties are to his tribe. So once you disrupted that, it was not possible to transmit readily some of these values, oral traditions, norms, and so on, because the intention of the planter class was to extract as much as they possibly could from the African labor force. And of course, they wanted to prevent potential mutiny, rebellion, or even revolution. So the African had it difficult. Nevertheless, Africans have been able to contribute not only to the social and economic formation of the Caribbean or Caribbean societies, but they supplied labor to the extent that the planter class became rich under sugar, because sugar largely became king as a result of that introduction. My take is that a lot can be learned from the Africans in that they brought certain customs that still existed. I remember one, and I smiled, we had kwekwe. That is an event before a wedding, the night before the wedding. They brought songs, food, the common metagy and the like. And by and large, they contributed to the social tapestry of the whole cultural makeup of the Caribbean societies. So for me, the impact of Africans was great. They introduced things like cooperatives. If we go back to the days of the village movement in places like Guyana, and in some quarters, people argued that they also introduced the planting of rice earlier. And rice has become a staple in Caribbean societies, though it was advanced by the next group that you mentioned, the Asians. And I understand that by the Asians, you mean both the Amerindians, the East Indians, the Chinese, and even the Indonesians later on that came to the region.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize I was muted there for a minute. I want to, you've said quite a bit there. And I suppose some of our viewers may be wondering, well, where are we going with this discussion? We're talking about the impact of changing gender roles, but we're providing a historical background. But permit me to ask Dr. English, are we more European than Asian or African? Is there a tension, and does it have any implication for the church?
Well, very, very, very good thought. I think basically the Asians and Africans in the Caribbean have been significantly affected or influenced by the value systems of the Europeans or the colonial lords, to the extent that their influence has overshadowed the subcultural elements of these groups to a significant extent. I think what happens in the Caribbean region is that our institutions, for example, have drawn significantly from Western Europe. For example, in the English-speaking Caribbean, we have drawn from the Westminster model. And in fact, the institutions that exist all mirror what transpires in England, in Britain, whether we talk about the legal and judicial system, whether we refer to the industrial relations system, our economic and fiscal policies and systems, education, religion, politics. We've all drawn from the Europeans or from the British to such an extent that the cultural practices of European societies tend to predominate. And what we call in international relations the issue of cultural imperialism has impacted the Caribbean so greatly. For example, not only from Europe, but even North America, that certain cultural practices that were germane to a very historical existence have become threatened. And we in the Caribbean have developed, as it were, the whole question of a dependency. We are, whatever we wear, whatever we eat and drink even now, we tend to want to adopt the European practices and way of life because we were oriented to think that what comes from the metropolis was superior to what existed in the Caribbean territory. So we have developed the attitude of inferiority, attitude of dependency, because we adopted the British culture as a benchmark for what we should do. We had an old adage in class that says whenever America sneezes, the Caribbean and Latin America catch a cold, because we see them as the pace setters. And whatever comes from abroad or outside the region was supposed to be superior.
Now, that's interesting, but I'm kind of wondering, does this have any implication for the way we do church?
I will say yes, and you may not like my comment as a man of the clergy in the church. Look the way we are dressed for this occasion. We are dressed in the European wear because we have been led to believe that this is what is right and proper for formal occasions. Why don't we have on an African wear, or if it were a woman, a sari or whatever? People coming to our congregations today are affected when they lack the capacity to keep up with the fashions and the styles that we have adopted from Europe and North America. And some people have commented, I cannot cope in such congregation. Those people lifestyle is beyond us. There are two other areas that I'd like to touch on apart from dress in the context. One is that people have taken up a stance. Traditional Africans who follow the traditions, they don't want to accept the Christian religion because they believe that the Christian religion was a strategy orchestrated to keep them subjugated or subjected. And therefore, they take an offense to the Christian religion. However, I would say, in a general sense, that notwithstanding the difficulties associated with European influence and the way we do church, I will say clearly that the Africans in a way benefited from the introduction to Christianity. Because if you look in the Caribbean today, Africans are more, it's easier to convert an African to Christianity following that tradition. And so the way we do church, to my mind, is not located in Caribbean realities, it's more an adoption from external forces outside of the region.
But you know, I'm tempted to ask you, before I comment on the dress code, is there such a thing as a Caribbean reality? Because what really is our historical roots? I mean, we do have African heritage, we do have the indigenous peoples who were here that a lot of people don't remember much about, and then there's the Indian influence, the Asian influence, you may say, because the Chinese and Indonesians and so on, as you mentioned. So after hundreds of years of of this, do we really have a reality? Can we say, well, you know, that culture is imposed upon us, but what really is our culture?
Culture is a very complex issue, since it represents the totality of a people's experiences. It has to do with knowledge, belief systems, norms, folklores, and so on. I would say, as we look at the dominant culture in any Caribbean society, there is somewhat of a mixture between some indigenous subcultural elements that are found to be responsive to dominant cultural thematics, for example, are accepted, but not every aspect of our culture or the subcultures are accepted. Only those that subscribe in a way to the dominant culture of the region, which was shaped historically outside of indigenous inputs. I mean, with independence, there were certain efforts made to preserve certain things, like Guyana. Some of the Amerindian traditions are maintained. The East Indian traditions, like holidays and so forth, and social practices are acceptable.
Well, but if you look at Guyana as an example, because you mentioned earlier, and I'm going to not linger on this too much so that we can get into the real issue of the change in gender roles. But if you look at Guyana, just permit me to say this, which is unlike Antigua and Barbados and, you know, some of the smaller islands, even Jamaica, Guyana is multi-ethnic. So you have significant numbers of Afro-Caribbean, but you also have Indo-Caribbeans. And then you do have not just Christianity, but Islam and to some extent Hindu as well in Guyana. So multi-ethnic, multi-religious. Now, when you look at the church, Christian church, I'm not talking about Seventh Adventists solely, but I'm talking about Christianity in general. Is it not true that the majority of Christian followers are Afro-Caribbean, and does that say anything about the tendency of the African influence as it aligns with Christianity?
Well, that's a very interesting comment. And there, to me, I see a reason for it. The reason being that when the Indians came, for example, to Guyana in 1838, the Indians were allowed to remain on the fringes of the plantation system. And they were allowed to practice their culture, their religion. And they were not coerced or forced into accepting the European way of life, because of course they wanted to maintain the economic sustainability of the sugar plantation, and the Indians proved to do that very well. So Indians were able to practice their culture and their religion for quite a while. African religious practices were disrupted, and they were introduced to monotheism, worship of one God, accepting Jesus Christ as the advocate between man and God, and between man and the Father, and so forth. So because of that historical background and the early orientations of Africans during slavery and after apprenticeship, Africans developed a passion for the worship of God. And for some of them, that's the only avenue for salvation, both spiritually and economically, I would say. So if you control, to my mind, the way a man thinks, it is easy for you to control his actions and his responses in situations. And because while we can say that the intention of the planter class was to use this religion as a means of control, it was functional. Functional in the sense that Blacks have inherited a strong conscience and the desire to serve the one God, so to speak. And that is why today, by implication, if you look at the church in Guyana, we are now trying to make inroads into the Indian population to join the church, but it's much more difficult to get Indians than to get Africans and mixed races because of that historical tradition.
Very interesting indeed. Well, we do have the historical background, and while it would be worthwhile to continue this discussion, I do want to get into what we really came to talk about. So let me ask you now, the issue of gender is, we are discussing the impact of changing gender roles. The issue of gender is much debated today. There are, of course, differences between sex, a function of biology, and gender, or what some call a societal construct. I believe, given the climate of today, it is important to comment on sex and gender because, our society has changed significantly over the years. So maybe if you can just share a bit on that as we segue into the impact of changing gender roles.
Dr. Greene, I'll say the issue of gender is indeed very topical and much debated today. I agree with you that there are sex differences, or there may exist sex differences between males and females based on, say, biological functions. However, some social scientists believe that there is no fundamental difference in the socialization of males and females, as used to be the case. Society has become more liberal, and what used to be yesterday's deviance has become today's norm in the society. I'll say that the traditional definition, for example, the family, is now being challenged. I mean, I know you discussed that last week, of that of a male adult and a female adult occupying common residence, sharing the basic essentials of life. Today, that definition is being challenged because emphasis is being placed on feelings and on perceptions rather than reality in determining sex and gender. One could feel like a male today and tomorrow feels like a female. And for some people, that is quite okay. Or you could feel like a male and a female the same day. The roles that we peg to men traditionally are gradually changing. And I'm sure as this discussion unfolds, we will examine those. But a lot of attention is given to emotions and feelings as we think about gender. I remember one professor asking me in Europe whether, or rather he held the view that there is no difference between male and female socialization. And I said, yes, I have one difference. That's using the washroom. And of course, he was very upset and took offense to my probably simplistic example. But clearly, we coming from a Caribbean reality. There were things that were considered to be male things, or what males should do, what females should do. And it was taboo crossing those lines. So when we look at gender, it's not only about the biological aspects, but the social construct. Who am I? Who are you? we are what society says we are. And therefore, the Caribbean societies and its normative standards and principles would have helped in a significant way to share the issue of whether we are male, whether we are female in terms of our influence and positioning.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm beginning to think that we really don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of details, but we're going to take our time. We're going to, if we're not finished today, we'll come back next week, because you said something just now that kind of sparked my interest, and that is the concept of feelings, that we have allowed feelings to govern our whole approach to life, and that's rather very interesting, because you know, if it's how I feel, and feelings fluctuates, you know, there is a lot of fluidity there, and perhaps that's why we have so much discussion about gender fluidity. But let me ask you this question, because traditionally males and females, as you rightly said, fulfilled very different functions. Males were considered the providers. Females were primarily responsible for, may I say, child rearing and home care. How has that system shaped our societies? And where we are now, are we seeing any consequence of that today?
Yes, there are consequences for every action. There is a consequence. Traditionally, men were considered, as you rightly said, providers, while women stayed at home and engaged in child rearing practices. And in some instances, they were engaging in cottage industries, something that is somewhat dying away to some extent in Caribbean societies. This traditional system of men performing certain roles and women performing certain roles, that tradition has affected us. Men see their wives, I want to say, from a sociological standpoint, men see their wives as mothers and are not prepared to carry out certain roles, even when their wives are stressed. And this is a serious issue, because it was a historical notion that we continue to perpetuate, where the Caribbean man is perceived to be macho, wears washing, sweeping, doing laundry, cooking, caring for the children, etc., must be done by the women, even when the women and wives are working outside of the home. It's become a real challenge. And don't think this does not mean the church. I can tell you it does. Specific gender roles have led to conflicts and render the male uncomfortable to do certain things for himself. In my opinion, it affects the male significantly, and therefore the family is in crisis. The relationship becomes transactional and thrives only with a norm of reciprocity. I say that to say that as women become empowered, men find it difficult to deal with that. And I know we may go in that direction as we go along, but because of the rigidity in these roles, no flexibility, it creates enormous problems. And there is always the absence of emotional intelligence in dealing with these issues at the level of the family. I recall a lady once complaining that having worked all day, she returned home having picked up the children to see her husband watching television. He continues to watch while she washed the wares and began to make supper. Having completed the task of making supper she provided for him, he ate, returned to his television. She did the washing up, put the children to sleep. And by Jove, after that, he was looking for emotional satisfaction for her to respond to his sexual needs. This has come as a result of his orientation, where a woman must do this irrespective of the circumstances. So those things are having serious challenges today, and they must be addressed.
Well, I'm wondering, because we started a discussion a little earlier, trying to provide a historical context. But where did this come from? Is this a direct result of slavery? Was this the intention of the plantocracy, that roles were different, that males were not supposed to do certain things, females were not supposed to do certain things? How is it that we are where we are? There's no doubt that this is the case. As a family life counselor, I see this all the time. This has created significant challenges in relationships. But how did we get there?
I mean, sociologists in the region have pointed to the whole question of matrifocality and its impact, because under slavery, women were encouraged to breed from as many men as possible, because the family identity needed to be disrupted as an instrument of control. And therefore, the male did not see himself having a responsibility for certain roles and functions in a family. He was only to make provision of the means. So this could very well be a legacy of slavery and the plantation system. Because when we look at broken homes and families and single parent, visiting and friending relationships, it could well be traced back to slavery, where the man did not take that kind of responsibility, was more or less detached from the family and might probably just have been a visitor.
Interesting. Now, as we seek to get deeper into this discussion, the reality is a lot of people are affected by that posture, that attitude. Now it is said that education is one of the most transformative influences in a society. I know of cultures, and those of us who listen to the news, what is happening in Afghanistan with the Taliban is a good example, where girls are not encouraged to go to school. The Seventh Adventist Church is a church that has great emphasis on education. It can, I suppose, therefore, be argued that Christian churches took the lead in providing education. I as a child, I went to a school that was once, and a lot of the early schools in Antigua were Christian schools, the Moravian churches, etc. Now the Seventh Adventists have come along and have continued that emphasis on Christian education. So I suppose it can be argued that Christianity on a whole, the Christian church, has put great emphasis, or has taken the lead in providing education for the region. To what extent has education played a role in changing the dynamics of the region, the roles? When we go to school, we're educated. We know that this thing about males doing one thing, females doing another thing. Education tends to interfere with those things and provide a level playing field. To what extent has Christianity been responsible for the change in dynamics?
Well, I would say that Christianity has been a very potent force in terms of promoting the transformational element of education. Because historically, the church has played a role in the Caribbean, as you rightly said, from colonial times to now. And religion is regarded as an instrument of socialization and social change. The first schools were operated by the clergy, for there was a nexus between education and religion, since both were perceived or are perceived by sociologists as agents of social change, and I will say agent for political socialization as well. So through education, people became aware of new ways of doing things. They've become enlightened. And if you take a simple definition of education, if I can recall, education is like life itself. And life at its best is a changing, flowering process. It speaks therefore to the dynamism of education, where curricula changes based on so many factors, not only based on philosophy and theories, but in terms of what is obtaining in a practical sense in the environment. And therefore, the church fuels that change, to my mind, because up until 1976, in the context of Guyana, education was provided by both church and school. And then with the socialist orientation and philosophy coming on board, education became a function of the state entirely. Nevertheless, the church continued with education, even though it might have been done in an informal way. And therefore, I can connect with, I'll say, a statement from Nelson Mandela, who said education is the most powerful weapon that changed the world. And therefore, for me, as I look at Caribbean societies and the role that the church plays, our own institution, Caribbean Union College, has been in existence for nearly a century. And therefore, there was serious emphasis on education for transformation. You see, education must be viewed in a holistic sense. And here is where I would say the Adventist Church must be credited for its impact on the education of the young, because we promote an education that is balanced, holistic. We do not only cater to the affective, physical, the affective, psychomotor, and cognitive domains. We promote the spiritual or moral dimension of education. And these, to my mind, have had a greater impact in helping the Caribbean youth or the young person to see his or her role differently in the context of what is germane to development or what is functional, as against sticking to some old traditional function that breeds conflict and disorder.
Doc, you know, I want to posit that if education does play such a significant role, is a change agent, well, the question is, who is changing? When I look at, and it is a problem I think we have in our Caribbean cultures, and something that, you know, we will go deeper into even next week. But when I look at our societies today, it appears that it is the females who are taking advantage of the educational opportunities. Most of our secondary schools are filled with girls. The universities, the majority of the people there are females. Even in our working establishments, we're finding significantly more females than males. I mean, I was looking at some statistics in Antigua, and it shows that while more males are born than females, and up to the end of primary school, we have more males than females. By the time you hit Form 1, Form 2, there begins to be a reversal, and then females just lead out after that. So if our girls are now getting exposed to education and they're being influenced to change their perspective, their way of life, etc., and the men remain, what kind of challenge does that present for societies?
That's an enormous challenge, and you see it every day. As women become more educated, because as we said before, if you control how a person thinks, you can control the actions of a person. The element of control that a man once had in Caribbean society is gradually disappearing because of the impact of education. Educated women, progressive women, who earn a lot economically, find it difficult to submit to a man that is uneducated and unprogressive. And that's a real challenge. Number of families have been affected when women go on to tertiary education and men remain stagnant. You see, from the onset, men were not going for education in certain positions because they felt that that could not pay them. And since they were the providers, they were trying to find jobs and possibilities to provide adequately for the family. So we have missed the bus. We now need to re-educate our young men to understand that education does three things, as philosophy teaches. It gives you power. It prepares you for the good life. It gives you tone and style. And therefore the class, education is an enabling mechanism for class. And therefore, as the females benefit from this enabling mechanism, they have a fundamental difference to be tugging along a man that does not read. And not me, I'm not becoming disrespectful to the male species because I'm a man. But we need to take control of this element. The dropout rates from school for male is higher than for female. Long ago at university levels, men were dominating. Now it has changed. In my class, you have about 80% female. And may I say sometimes you encounter some men who are there or thereabout. So the point that we need to zero in on is that we have to look at the mechanism of getting our women also to understand the issue of balance. And some women today prefer not to be married than have to settle for, even in the church, because compatibility is not only about similarity in religious doctrines and beliefs, it has to do with a number of other elements. So this is a worrying challenge. And I note I'm not, education for me must be for use. I'm not saying that the man must have a university degree, because we read for a degree. And therefore, men need to step up to the plate and keep themselves alert and in tune with these changes. You don't have to have a degree to marry a woman with a PhD, but you must be teachable and demonstrate a capacity that you have understanding of social, economic, political issues affecting the society and affecting life generally. It's not just about having a degree that is creating the problem, but whether you are kept abreast with trends and developments in the world. This is a very heavy topic that could have probably taken the entire session.
Well, this is the very point I was just going to comment. I mean, it's very worrying to me personally, because, you know, I mean, our ladies are complaining. I was intending to wait until next week to go into the issue of how all of this is impacting the church. But our ladies are complaining. They're saying we can't find men to marry because they're not progressive enough. And there's another element that I won't go into right now, but that creates a particular challenge, right? If it is that it is the ladies who are taking hold of the educational opportunities, and I agree with you, we are not just thinking in terms of degreed people, but we're thinking in terms of individuals who are knowledgeable, the practical dimension of education. If it is that it is the ladies who are taking hold of the opportunities for self-advancement and development, etc., pretty soon we are finding ourselves in a place where these ladies are not satisfied to join themselves to men who are not progressive. That, maybe I should ask you, how is that impacting our societies?
It would, because the Apostle Paul says it's better to marry than to burn. And therefore, if women remain unfulfilled, they may turn to other things, and some of these things might not be desirable. We have the LGBT community. I mean, looking outside of the church, women look for alternatives, or probably to piggyback on progressive men who might want to live a double life, who do not uphold the principles of God. Some women say, oh, all I need is a child. I don't need a man to maintain my child or children because I am independent. So virtually they just took the man as a sperm donor to satisfy another element of their life, wanting to be fruitful. But to be saddled or to be controlled by a man who does not have style, power, class, nor tone becomes a real challenge. This has also led to increasing divorce rates, separation, desertion, and a number of other ills. And therefore, men are being called upon to man up, take control. And what has happened, there's another side of it that I didn't want to go into, the question of domestic violence. Because when the women who are married and are empowered and cannot stand the tribe, they react. And then the man feels he's a macho Caribbean man. He wants to subjugate her by force. And so you have a real challenge, a real problem.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Our time is ebbing away. We have about 6 more minutes, believe it or not. And we have so much more, but we have next week as well and the following week. So let me just get back here, because our females are no longer staying at home. We began the program by saying that once upon a time the lady was the homemaker, was the mother. You know, their responsibility was to take care of the children, take care of the home, and the men went out and they became the providers. Perhaps with education, we are seeing a change in that, and so ladies are no longer staying at home. What I think we can see clearly, or yes, there is a change in gender roles. So the question is, what kinds of sociological impact is this change in gender role having? Women are now becoming providers, or the chief providers. We have so many homes with single parents, where the lady is the one who provides for all of her children. And sometimes it's not even a single parent home. The man is there as well, but he is not providing because he has not equipped himself adequately. So the question we're looking at the sociological impact of all of this. I know we spoke to some of it already, and I understand that it's a general question, but one step at a time.
Yeah, if you look at the social problems or issues associated with what I'll say maternal deprivation, where the woman has got to focus on the economic sustainability of the family. You have things like truancy, juvenile delinquency, teenage pregnancies, drug abuse, pornography. Those are all social issues and problems facing the young when the mother is absent, having to focus on the economic realities to engender sustainability. There is maternal neglect, which carries a host of other problems. We may say that, okay, the woman may employ another woman as a babysitter and to look at issue. But do you know that when you bring a babysitter or someone, those who are impacting your children from young, they are shaping the minds and controlling the direction of the children. So you may end up becoming the consummate professional, highly successful, but you've lost your children for whom you had a sacred responsibility. So that's another side of it. The social problems and social issues can weigh very heavily. And even the servant of the Lord would have advised that for young children, mothers need to take control, because he who rocks the cradle shapes the world. And if the person that's rocking the cradle is not the mother, it means that the one who rocking the cradle is shaping the character of that child, because the child is spending more time with that person than the biological mother, who might be fortified with all the fundamental principles guiding family life and development, what is proper and what is not proper. So that's the crux of the matter.
It's very interesting. Well, with just a few more minutes, next week we are going to look at the implications for the church. For now, though, we sometimes have situations where ladies are choosing to have children. You kind of mentioned part of it just now. Have children later and generally choosing to have less or sometimes even no children. So if there is an increasing number of females who are having children later in life or having no children, that also creates a challenge for societies, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's another option that we don't look at in the church, where the woman needs a child and she goes and have fertilization outside, got the sperm from somewhere else. She didn't engage in sex. It would be interesting for us to determine whether that's adultery or sin. But people are doing all kinds of things in order to maintain their balance and have certain privileges that they would obviously like to have, because maternity is a fact of life, while paternity is more an act of faith. I mean, I'm not digging at the men, but for women, that's a tremendous achievement. You can lie about your father, but your mother is your mother.
We only have 2 minutes, so I don't want to ask you another question necessarily. If perhaps you can give a brief summary of the main takeaways you want people to get from our discussion today, and that's how we'll wrap it up, and we'll just continue from here next week.
What I will say, given the changes that have taken place in Caribbean societies as a result of the impact of education, I will say that the church needs to play a major role in educating men and women as to how to create a balance and still live happy family lives, notwithstanding variations in economic strength or educational giftedness. I will also want to say that we should focus on the young men under our charge and try to give them a new perspective on life, something different from what they're seeing on social media. Because some boys still have one guy said to me, I don't have to work anywhere. Once I could get a woman with a house and a good car, and she's working, I'm comfortable. You see where that is going? Mm-hmm. He is not considering the whole question of independence and maintaining the traditional role as a provider. And some are saying, no, I am macho, I keep myself physically fit and macho, and therefore people will pay me for services. So we have a whole new wave and dynamic in the society, but as a church, God has called us to act, and act expeditiously if we are really going to create change.
Well, it has been a very interesting discussion, and we're going to continue the discussion next week. Next week, we hope also to go into the whole impact of the movement, the female liberation movement, and see how that impacts the church and society. I want to thank you so much, Dr. English, for sharing with us. It has been an intriguing discussion, and I know, again, there were limitations of time. Some of those areas that were raised are very significant, but I trust that everybody who listened today gave serious consideration, especially to the challenge we are experiencing. I didn't make reference this week in our Caribbean news. We saw the tragedy in St. Vincent. 5 men got gunned down. You know, what is our what is becoming of our Caribbean men, and that is something that should bother all of us. But that's where we stay for today. All our time is up. And so we want to encourage all of our viewers to join us next week again at 3 p.m. Atlantic Caribbean time, when we continue with this very intriguing discussion about the sociological impacts of changing gender roles and female liberation movement. May God bless you all. Until next week, same time.